It was a calm Tuesday afternoon in Cedarville, a small suburban town where everyone knew each other's name, business, and routine. The air was filled with the faint hum of chatter, the chirping of birds, and the occasional rustle of leaves. Life in Cedarville moved at a slow, predictable pace, safe and uneventful. 10-year-old Ella Johnson strolled down the familiar streets, her small frame weighed slightly by the backpack she carried, yet her steps were light. She hummed a cheerful tune, her ponytail swaying with every bounce. The sun cast a warm golden hue over the neighborhood, and the smell of freshly cut grass lingered in the air. It was the kind of day where nothing could possibly go wrong. Or so Ella thought, as she turned the corner, nearing the park she always passed on her way home. The tranquility of the afternoon was shattered by the piercing sound of sirens. Ella froze, her heart skipping a beat as the wailing grew louder and louder. A police car sped around the corner, its red and blue lights flashing like a warning. Ella's first thought was panic. Was there an accident? Was someone in trouble? But the car came to a sudden, jarring halt right beside her, and for reasons she couldn't comprehend, her heart began to race. The driver's side window rolled down, and out peered the familiar but stern face of Officer Callahan. Ella had seen him before. He was a figure of authority in the community, someone who should inspire a sense of security, but not for her. She'd heard the whispers about him. He was the kind of man people avoided, the kind who had a reputation for being overly harsh, biased, and quick to wield his power. "Hey, you!" Officer Callahan barked, his voice sharp enough to slice through Ella's thoughts. She blinked, looking around as if to confirm that he was indeed addressing her. "Yes, sir," she said timidly, clutching her backpack straps. "What are you doing out here by yourself?" he asked, his tone accusatory. Ella frowned, unsure of how to respond. She'd been walking this route home from school for years. It wasn't unusual, it was routine. But the way Officer Callahan stared at her, as if she had done something wrong, sent a chill down her spine. "I'm just walking home," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. But her answer didn't seem to satisfy him. He opened the car door, stepping out with a deliberate thud of his boots on the pavement. His tall, imposing figure towered over Ella as he approached her. "I said, what are you doing here?" he repeated, his voice growing harsher. Ella stepped back instinctively, her pulse quickening. I just told you. I'm going home," she stammered, her confusion giving way to fear. Officer Callahan's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing her as though he were searching for a reason to distrust her. His hand moved to his belt, and for the first time, Ella noticed the cold glint of handcuffs hanging there. "You think you can just wander around here like this?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. "We'll see about that." Before Ella could process his words, his large hand reached out and grabbed her arm. The grip was tight, too tight, and she winced as he pulled her closer. "You're under arrest," he said bluntly, his tone laced with contempt. "What?" Ella gasped, her voice trembling. "But I didn't do anything." "Suspicious activity," he said curtly, as if that explanation was enough. The world seemed to tilt around her. She looked around desperately, hoping someone would intervene. People were walking by, neighbors she recognized, but they all hesitated, glancing between the officer and Ella with uncertainty. A few even pulled out their phones, recording the scene, but no one stepped forward to help. "Please," Ella begged, her voice barely a whisper as tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't do anything wrong." But Officer Callahan wasn't listening. He pulled out the handcuffs, the metal cold and unyielding as he snapped them around her small wrists. Ella flinched at the sensation, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. The officer shoved her toward the squad car, muttering under his breath. His words were low, almost inaudible, but filled with disgust. Ella's legs felt like they would give out beneath her as she stumbled forward. The bystanders murmured amongst themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others too afraid to challenge the officer's authority. "Get in," Callahan growled, opening the back door of the car and pushing her inside. Ella felt her stomach twist as the cold metal seat pressed against her. She glanced out the window, her wide, tear-filled eyes scanning the crowd. She wanted someone, anyone, to speak up, to ask why this was happening. but no one did. As the door slammed shut, the noise reverberated through the car, sealing Ella in. She stared blankly ahead, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She was just a kid. What could she have possibly done to deserve this? Officer Callahan slid into the driver's seat, the air between them heavy with tension. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set in a hard line. Ella could feel his gaze in the rearview mirror, cold and unforgiving. The police car began to move, pulling away from the scene, leaving behind the murmuring crowd. Ella sat frozen, her small hands trembling in the cuffs. She wanted to wake up, to realize this was all some horrible dream. But the cold metal against her skin told her otherwise. And as the squad car drove deeper into the town, Ella's fear only grew. She had no idea where she was being taken or what would happen to her next. All she knew was that her life had just taken a turn she never could have anticipated, and nothing would ever be the same again. The squad car rolled down the quiet streets of Cedarville, the flashing lights extinguished but the tension inside still suffocating. Ella sat in the back seat, her small frame shivering despite the warm afternoon. She stared out the window, watching familiar landmarks blur into a haze, her thoughts racing in tandem with the motion of the car. She couldn't understand why this was happening. What had she done? Why wasn't anyone stopping it? Her small hands twisted in the cold, unforgiving cuffs, the metal biting into her skin. It felt surreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Officer Callahan's silence was worse than his accusations. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched as he muttered to himself. Ella couldn't make out the words, but she could feel the anger radiating off him. It made her stomach churn. At a stoplight, Callahan glanced back at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing. "You kids think you can do whatever you want," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Not in my town." Ella's breath hitched. She opened her mouth to protest, to plead, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, and tears threatened to spill over. She wanted to scream that she was just a little girl, that she hadn't done anything wrong, but something about the officer's glare made her freeze. As the car moved again, Ella's attention was drawn to the people outside. A small crowd had gathered on the corner where she'd been arrested. Some were still filming on their phones, while others whispered among themselves. Their faces blurred as the car sped away, but one expression stood out. A young woman in her 20s stared after the car with a look of disgust and determination. Ella didn't know her, but something about the way the woman looked at her gave her a small flicker of hope. The hope was short-lived. The car pulled into the parking lot of the Cedarville police station, the large brick building looming like a fortress. Ella's stomach sank further as Callahan shifted the car into park, the engine humming for a moment before falling silent. He stepped out first, slamming the door behind him. For a brief second, Ella thought about running, but her hands were bound, and her legs felt like jelly. She knew it would be pointless. The back door swung open, and Callahan's rough hand grabbed her arm, yanking her out. "Let's go," he said gruffly, his grip unrelenting. Ella stumbled as he pulled her toward the building, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the sounds of the bustling station as they stepped inside. The air was cool and sterile, the walls lined with dark wood panels that seemed to close in on her. Officers walked briskly through the halls, some carrying files, others chatting in low tones. No one seemed to notice, or care, that a frightened little girl was being dragged through the building like a common criminal. Callahan led her down a long corridor, his boots echoing with each heavy step. Ella's own footsteps were hesitant, her sneakers scuffing against the polished floor. She wanted to cry, to shout for help, but the fear in her chest kept her silent. They stopped in front of a small holding room at the end of the hallway. Callahan opened the door and shoved Ella inside. She stumbled but managed to catch herself before falling. The room was cold and bare, with a single metal bench bolted to the wall. "Sit," Callahan ordered, pointing to the bench. Ella obeyed, her wrists aching as she tried to adjust her position. She looked up at the officer, her wide, tear-filled eyes pleading for an explanation. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong." Callahan snorted, crossing his arms. "You don't need to know why, kid. Just sit there and stay quiet. He turned and walked out, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. The sound echoed in the small room, leaving Ella alone with her thoughts. She stared at the floor, her mind spinning. The events of the past hour played over and over in her head like a broken record. She tried to make sense of it, but nothing added up. Why had he arrested her? What suspicious activity was he talking about? Minutes passed, maybe hours. It was hard to tell. Ella's sense of time had completely unraveled. She shifted uncomfortably on the cold bench, her wrists still sore from the cuffs. Her stomach growled, but she barely noticed. The door opened suddenly, startling her. A female officer entered, her short dark hair neatly combed and her uniform pristine. Her expression was calm but serious, and her eyes softened slightly when they landed on Ella. "What's your name, sweetheart?" the officer asked, her voice much gentler than Callahan's. "Ella," she stammered. "Ella Johnson." The officer nodded, making a quick note on the clipboard she was holding. "I'm Officer Ramirez," she said. "I'm here to make sure you're okay." Ella's lip quivered, but she managed to nod. Ramirez sat down across from her, folding her hands in her lap. "Do you know why you're here?" Ella shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "No, I was just walking home from school, and that officer, he said I was under arrest, but I didn't do anything." Ramirez's expression darkened slightly, but not at Ella. She glanced down at the file in her hand before meeting Ella's gaze again. "I know you're scared," Ramirez said softly, "and I know this doesn't make any sense right now, but I need you to trust me, okay? You're not in trouble." Ella blinked, confused. "Then why did he arrest me?" Ramirez hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the closed door. "Officer Callahan. He's been under investigation for a while now. What he did to you today, it's not the first time he's acted this way. But I promise you, we're going to figure this out." Ella's heart raced. Callahan was under investigation? Did that mean he'd done this to other people too? The thought made her stomach turn. Ramirez reached out, placing a comforting hand on Ella's shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said firmly. "We're going to fix this." For the first time since her arrest, Ella felt a small glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her from breaking completely. She nodded, swallowing hard as Ramirez offered her a reassuring smile. But deep down, Ella knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The air in the small holding room felt heavier as Officer Ramirez left to confront Callahan, leaving Ella alone once again. Despite Ramirez's reassurances, the weight of the situation hadn't lifted entirely. Ella sat motionless on the cold bench, her legs dangling over the edge. She stared at her hands, now free from the cuffs but still tingling from the harsh pressure they'd endured. Her mind swirled with unanswered questions. What had she done to deserve this? What kind of person would arrest a child without cause? And if Callahan had done this to others, why was he still wearing a badge? From outside the room, muffled voices filtered through the thick door. Ella couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably tense. She edged closer to the door, straining to hear. A deep, gruff voice, Callahan, rose above the others. His words were sharp, laced with anger and defensiveness. "You don't get to question my judgment," he barked. "I've been doing this job long enough to know suspicious behavior when I see it." A second voice, calm yet authoritative, cut through his rant. Ella recognized it as Officer Ramirez. "What you call suspicious behavior is just a girl walking home from school, Callahan. You've crossed the line again, and this time, we're not letting it slide." Ella's heart raced. The tension in their voices made her stomach churn. She edged back to the bench as heavy footsteps approached the door. It swung open abruptly, revealing Callahan's towering figure. His face was flushed, his jaw tight as he avoided looking directly at Ella. Behind him stood Ramirez and the other officer Ella had seen earlier, the one with the quiet confidence. Her presence alone seemed to unnerve Callahan, though he did his best to hide it. "Ella," Ramirez said gently, stepping into the room, "this is Captain Monroe. She's here to help." Captain Monroe nodded at Ella, her expression firm but not unkind. There was something in her gaze that made Ella feel safer, like Monroe wasn't just there to check a box or file a report. She was there to fix what had gone wrong. Ella tried to sit up straighter, wiping at her tear-streaked face. "Am I in trouble?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No, sweetheart," Monroe replied, her tone softer than Ella had expected. "You've done nothing wrong. I'm sorry this happened to you." The apology caught Ella off guard. No one had apologized to her yet. Not the people who had filmed her arrest, not the officers who had ignored her frightened protests, and certainly not Callahan. Monroe turned her attention to Callahan, her expression hardening. "Step outside," she ordered. Callahan bristled. "With all due respect, Captain." "That wasn't a request," Monroe interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through his protest. For a moment, it looked like Callahan might argue, but the weight of Monroe's authority was too much to defy. He glared at her before turning on his heel and leaving the room, slamming the door behind him. Ella flinched at the sound, her body tensing. Ramirez placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and Monroe crouched slightly to meet Ella's eye level. "Ella," Monroe began, her voice steady, "I need you to tell me everything that happened today. Take your time. We want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Ella hesitated. Her mind was still a jumble of fear and confusion, but the sincerity in Monroe's eyes gave her the courage to speak. She recounted the events as best as she could, the walk home, the sirens, Callahan's accusations, and how he had ignored her pleas for an explanation. When she finished, Monroe nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you," she said. "You did the right thing by telling us." Ramirez chimed in. "Ella, we're going to take this very seriously. You shouldn't have been treated that way, and we're going to make sure Callahan answers for what he did." Ella's chest tightened. "Will he come after me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Monroe said firmly. "He won't. And if he tries, we'll be here to protect you." Ella nodded, though the lingering fear in her heart wasn't so easily dispelled. As Monroe and Ramirez stepped outside to discuss the next steps, Ella remained in the room, staring at the walls. For the first time, she began to feel the weight of her exhaustion. Her body ached, her eyes burned from crying, and all she wanted was to go home. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the door opened again. This time, it was a kind-faced woman in plain clothes, holding a steaming cup of cocoa. "Hi, Ella," the woman said softly. "I'm Sarah. I'm here to take you home." Ella's eyes widened. "I can go home?" Sarah nodded, her smile gentle. "Yes, sweetie. But first, Captain Monroe wants to make sure everything is set up so you'll be safe." Ella hesitated before reaching for the cocoa. It was warm in her hands, the first bit of comfort she'd felt all day. She took a small sip, the sweetness easing the lump in her throat. Not long after, Monroe and Ramirez returned. Monroe knelt beside Ella once again, her tone serious but kind. "Ella, we've contacted your parents, and they're on their way. I also want you to know that we've opened an investigation into Officer Callahan's actions. What he did was wrong, and we're going to make sure he's held accountable." "Will he go to jail?" Ella asked quietly. "That depends," Monroe said carefully. "But what matters is that he won't be able to hurt anyone else. Not you, not anyone." Ella nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. When her parents arrived, their faces were a mixture of relief and fury. Her mother wrapped her in a tight hug, tears streaming down her face, while her father demanded answers from Monroe. Monroe handled it with grace, explaining the situation and assuring them that steps were being taken to address the misconduct. As they left the station, Ella glanced back one last time. She caught a glimpse of Callahan through a window, his expression unreadable as Monroe spoke to him. Ella didn't know what would happen to him, but she hoped it would be enough to stop him from doing this to anyone else. As the family drove away, Ella leaned against her mother, the exhaustion finally overtaking her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: this experience had changed her forever. And while the road ahead might be uncertain, she found solace in the knowledge that people like Ramirez and Monroe were fighting to make things right. For the first time all day, Ella allowed herself to believe that things might get better.